This reading that we have had from the gospel always makes me nervous because Jesus is finding fault with the faithful followers. He is looking at them and he is pointing out that there is a group of folks, the faithful, who are pursuing power and prestige, who are focused on status and success, and the way they're defining success is this. Success is who you are and what you have. In fact, he notes that this is a group of folks who are bent on consuming, even consuming what rightfully belongs to others. That they're all about appearances, even appearances of faithfulness, but the problem is their words and their actions aren't matching up. And he's watching these same folks in their giving. And he is aware that they are giving simply out of their leftovers to God. Jesus seems to know how very easy it is to trust in our money instead of trusting God. Seems to be very aware that we can put all our time and energy into accumulating possessions or creating appearances rather than putting time and energy into loving God and loving neighbor as ourselves. What he had no way of knowing is how in the 21st century we would be bombarded with messages of all kinds that tell us that we should be dissatisfied with what we have, that tell us that our discontentment is good, and that if we will only buy that one more thing, then that one more thing, then that one more thing, we will be satisfied with life. Jesus is pointing out among faithful folks that they are living in discontentment. This is what you might call restless heart syndrome. At least it's what Adam Hamilton in his book Enough calls it. If you've had restless leg syndrome, you know what he's playing with here. Restless leg syndrome makes your legs twitch and contract in a way that it just takes all your attention. You are totally distracted by it. Restless heart syndrome is the same thing, only it's about our hearts and souls. It is that place of not being satisfied with what we have. Now, I want to make very clear that I'm not talking about the yearning in our hearts for God. I'm not talking about that deep yearning that we have to live lives that are meaningful and purposeful. I'm not talking about our yearning to grow into the people that God's created us to be. These yearnings are good. But isn't it interesting that so often we get satisfied with our relationship with God, with whatever meaning we're finding in life, with not growing? Those are the things we tend to get pretty satisfied about. We're not talking about those when we're talking about restless heart syndrome. We are talking about what it is to be focused on getting stuff, to look for perfection in our jobs, in our church, in our family, and to be so filled with discontent that all we can see is what's wrong. Today we will be talking about both contentment and simplicity, choosing to live more simply. And we're talking about them together because they go hand in hand. To be content is to choose to live more simply. And to choose to live more simply is to cultivate a sense of contentment. And so let's take a look at 4 keys to contentment with the words of the Apostle Paul echoing in our ears. The words that he wrote in Philippians 4:11 and 12, I have learned to be content in all things. What might that look like for us today? Number 1 is to remember that it could be worse. When you get into your 5-year-old vehicle, you say, it could be worse. When you look at repairs that need to be done on the house, you say, it could be worse. When you're having a bad day at work, you say, it could be worse. When you are frustrated with the pastor, you say, it could be worse. When you're looking at your parents or your children or your grandchildren and they are making you nuts, you say, it could be worse. And when you look at your spouse and you've got a real problem there, you don't say it out loud. However, you do, in your mind, say, it could be worse. I often hear those of you that are going through a difficult time say to me, there are so many people who have it much worse than I do. And what I hear is a focus on that which is good, even when times are tough. And that's what this mantra, it could be worse, is all about. Number 2. In order to cultivate contentment, before you go buy something you think you have got to have, ask yourself this question: how long will it make me happy? True confessions, I don't know how many times there was something I thought I had to have that once I bought it, well, it wasn't long before I sort of had forgotten how much I thought I really need to have what it was. To ask ourselves, how long will this make me happy, is to think seriously about if this is really necessary in order to be content. Number 3 is exactly what I was talking about with the children today, to develop an attitude of gratitude, to give thanks for what is good in our lives. A number of years ago, there was an author who wrote a book that encouraged us to every day find 5 blessings. It is that idea, again, of focusing on all that is good and all that God has given us. Number 4 is to ask this question: what truly satisfies my soul? What truly satisfies my soul? Our society, our culture says that our souls are satisfied by having more, by getting more, by going to the mall. But our faith says our souls are satisfied by God. St. Augustine said that each of us has a God-sized hole in our hearts that only God can fill. To find meaning in life, to find purpose in life, is to figure out how God is calling us to love God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. This is what gives satisfaction to our souls. To cultivate contentment is to cultivate simplicity. Simplicity is doing more with less. Often we are told we should do more with more. The problem is that doing more with more and more and more and more and more is that it gives us more stress. It costs us more money, more time, more energy, because if we're getting more, we've got more maintenance. To focus on more and more and more is to get on that hamster wheel and run as hard as we can and exhaust ourselves. And not only that, it uses up the resources of our earth in ways that simply are not sustainable. So how do we move toward voluntary simplicity? You can probably come up with all kinds of ideas on your own. And so what I'm sharing with you this morning is just sort of a way of priming the pump as you think about that question. To choose simplicity is to decrease our consumption of things, to live below our means. This would be a great topic for a Sunday school class or a Bible study, or even around the kitchen table, because the ways are myriad. It might be setting the heat lower in your home in the winter, or the air conditioner higher in the summer, or even going without air conditioning when you can. It might be a more fuel-efficient vehicle. It might be buying smaller instead of larger, or mid-size or midline instead of top of the line. It might even be using cloth bags to go shopping rather than paper or plastic. To decrease consumption is also to develop a family response to all the commercials that tell us we need to go buy more. We need to be discontent with what we have. That when commercials come on, your family might decide to say, "Are you kidding me?" Or your family might decide to say, "You can't take it with you." But I'll guarantee that particularly if your family has children and grandchildren who are caught by commercials, this becomes a very good way of helping them think about what it is to decrease consumption, to live more simply, to be content. Number 2, before you make a purchase, ask yourself why. Ask yourself if you really need it. So often the purchases that we make are more about our self-esteem than what we actually need. We women call it retail therapy. And so asking that question helps move beyond retail therapy. Number 3, to begin to practice voluntary simplicity looks like choosing to go with more inexpensive ways of entertainment. Some of the things that my kids fondly remember from childhood is simply playing games around the table. Zoe mentioned playing Monopoly with her dad. These are ways that can be very meaningful and yet are low cost. Number 4 is to use up what you have before you buy another. Sometimes that's not always possible, but particularly when it comes to vehicles or appliances, to simply use them for as long as they'll go and then buy another. And number 5 is this: to consider if making some big changes might be helpful in living more simply. Big changes meaning a smaller vehicle, or downsizing a home, or even letting go of a club membership that you are not using, with the understanding that possessions are not all there is to life.
All right, well, Jesus told us that our life does not consist in the abundance of our possessions. And every once in a while, we finally see that and we get it. I mean, most of the time the media is telling us that's not true, but every once in a while the media says, you know what, that's right. That happened this week in Southern California. When we were watching the news and we were seeing wildfires come and consume people's entire neighborhoods, there were 1 million people who were displaced for a period of time, and there were people who, like one family, I was watching the news, and in the middle of the night, their daughter awakened them, and they woke up and they smelled the smell of smoke. They looked out their back windows, and they watched as the fire leapt the interstate and was coming up the hill behind their house with the winds blowing it towards them. It was racing towards their house, and they realized they had this much time to get out. They had 10 minutes or less. They grabbed their children, they grabbed just a few things, they ran out to the car and escaped just before the flames engulfed a portion of their home and all of their neighbors' homes. And people came back and nothing was there. It was all gone. And suddenly you become aware, my life does not consist in the abundance of my possessions. I mean, what would you take with you? Now, this little boy, he saved his pillow. Of all the important possessions, it was his pillow. And this woman, she saved 2 photographs and a childhood book by Dr. Seuss. There was Angel. He saved a saxophone. He just started playing sax. And Karen, she saved her 2 cats. And Michelle, she saved her high school diploma and she saved her Bible. What would you save? What is it you're going to grab? And don't you already know this intuitively? You know none of that stuff in the end really matters. You know that when you die, all the pictures and all the videos and all that other stuff you collected is going in the garbage. Or maybe going to be sold at a garage sale by your kids or your grandkids. Was it worth it? And how long will it take you to learn that your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions? I want to invite us to learn that lesson and to live like it.
I don't know how many times Jeff and I have said as we have watched the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, how thankful we are simply for a roof over our heads. You see, this is the deal. You and I get to decide which tent we're going to live in. Just look out and look cute, okay? There you go. Are we going to live in the tent of discontentment? Got that? Or are we going to live in the tent of contentment? And it really is a choice that we have. Last week we talked about how love always has a cost. Love always requires sacrifice. And Jesus was noting of the faithful folks that were all focused on what they had and appearances that were giving out of their leftovers, that there was simply no sacrifice involved. But I also want to take a minute and note the widow who gave 2 copper coins. There are some of you sitting here today that are giving sacrificially of your time and your money, and you just wish it could be more. What you need to hear is that Jesus honors whatever we give sacrificially, even if it is 2 copper coins, that it's not about the amount. It is giving out of what we have that is what is honored. There are some of you who would give more time if your health were better, if the circumstances of your life were different. There are some of you that would give more money if that was just a possibility. So perhaps for you, living in a tent of contentment is to recognize that you are doing the best you can with what you have, and to know that that is honored. In fact, let me take this one step farther. If we would have read on into chapter 13, we hear Jesus very upset with the corruption of the religious institution that would take a widow woman's last 2 pennies. Listen closely to me. Are we called to give to God sacrificially out of what we have? Yes, that's how we show love. But are we called to give to a point that it sucks the life out of us? That's not what God asks of us. Giving to God through the church is to be life-giving. Giving to God through the church is not to become a financial hardship in a way that makes us wondering, how are we going to pay for our food and a roof over our head? That is not the point. And so again, I would say, if you are already giving sacrificially of your time and of your treasure, then hear God say to you, well done, good and faithful servant, and step into that tent of contentment. You see, to live in that tent, Kate's all comfy here, this is a good thing. To live in that tent is to recognize that all we have is a gift from God, and to give thanks for all we have. It is to ask God to guide us about how to use the time and the talent and the treasure that God has given us, and if need be, to change our hearts. It is to choose to live more simply and to give of what we have generously. And the choice is ours, to live in discontentment or contentment. Choose contentment. Hallelujah and amen.